Good morning, everyone. Super excited. Thanks for the introduction, Ksenia and Neben. I think it's kind of proper to first kind of acknowledge where I'm coming from. So my name is Vicenti. I'm an enrolled member of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. I'm currently an assistant professor of communication design at Nlaka'pamux University, which is situated on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Stolo First Nations, also known as Vancouver. And our work and studies as artists, designers, and educators are deeply influenced by the values, tenets, and perspectives of the peoples of this land. In acknowledging the territory, we are stating that we have responsibilities, reciprocities, and commitments to this land that we now call home. Unceded means that First Nation peoples never ceded or legally signed away their lands to the Crown or to Canada. Aboriginal people in BC assert that most of BC remains unceded sovereign native lands, over which neither the Canadian nor BC governments have the legal or moral authority to govern. A traditional territory is the geographic area identified by a First Nation as a land they and or their ancestors traditionally occupied and used. I also want to extend this out to our panelists, right? And recognize where they're coming from in their traditional homelands. And as academics, you know, the lands that we are occupying, you know, as guests. So I'd like to, move on to one of our next panelists, which was Dr. Jessica Moore, to allow her to introduce herself as well.
Good morning, afternoon. I'm not sure where everyone is from. It looks like we're from everywhere, so that's great. I am at my home in Owasso, Oklahoma, and I'm Osage, Otoe, and Pawnee, and Sac and Fox. My name is Dr. Jessica Moore Harjo. I went to graduate school at the University of Minnesota and got my PhD in design as well as my master's. But I want to specifically say that I got a PhD in design, and it's been really great. As far as I know, I've been told that I'm one of the first in graphic design, so I hope to see more to follow. And I'm going to share a little bit about my work later on, I guess the next panel or the next workshop. So it's good to see everyone.
Welcome, Dr. Harjo. Next is going to be Kathleen Sleboda.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Teresa Sleboda. I'm honored to be part of this panel on education. I'm a member of the Coldwater Indian Band of Merit, British Columbia, Canada's most westernmost province. We are Nlaka'pamux people, Interior Salish, from the Nicola Valley in British Columbia's interior, which is where my mother was born and raised. Today, I'm speaking to you from Boston, Massachusetts, on the ancestral and unceded land of the Massachusetts people. And I wish to recognize the stewardship and special relationship that they have with the land here. I live and work here in Boston and in New Haven, Connecticut, which is the homeland of the Quinnipiac people, and I wear many hats. I'm a freelance graphic designer who specializes in editorial design. I'm an illustrator. I'm a small business owner and publisher, and I run an online bookshop called Drawdown Books. I also teach graphic design, specifically with a focus on form making at Boston University and at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. Now, my path to the field of graphic design was circuitous. I actually grew up in San Francisco, and history was my first love. I wrote a senior thesis at Yale on the university's first recognized Native American graduate, the Ho-Chunk educator and minister, Henry Broadcloud. I then went to library school at the University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, where I was one of the first graduates of the First Nations core curriculum concentration, which focused on Indigenous information initiatives and systems. I worked at Huiwa Library, the only academic library branch in Canada that is entirely dedicated to Indigenous material, and subsequently took a position at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where I was an archivist for the Western Americana collection for a half decade. And then my journey took a left turn into graphic design about 15 years ago. Following an apprenticeship model, I learned the fine points of book and editorial design. And this work ultimately led me to classrooms in higher education, as well as working relationships with a number of cultural heritage institutions. I've taught and worked with undergraduate as well as graduate students in graphic design and adjacent fields, and worked at both public and private institutions. And if I could just pull out a few themes in my journey, they are an interest in memory, communication, both oral and visual, community, and accessibility. So Kukshwama, thank you.
Welcome, glad to have you, Kathleen. Our last panelist will be Sadie Redwing.
Hamadakyapi. Hello, everybody. My name is Sadie Redwing. I am a citizen of the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. I am also Cheyenne River Lakota. So essentially from Central South Dakota. I'm currently at OCADU. Shout out to my class watching right now, design processes. I got my BFA at the Institute of American Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Left there and went to grad school at North Carolina State University, so go Wolfpack. And it's been an interesting journey from grad school until now. So interned at NASA, taught at the University of Redlands, taught at the Indian University of North America, worked with American Indian College Fund, and now found myself teaching at OCADU. OCADU sits on the traditional territories of the Mississauga, the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and then those who occupy within this urban space. So I'm very excited to join this panel. And then within this space, and again, just to give a shout out to OCADU and teaching in two departments. I teach Indigenous materials and methods in the Indigenous Visual Culture program, as well as I teach design processes, publication, auditorial design with a focus on voice in the Department of Design. So extremely happy to be a part of this panel today.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you too, Sadie, and the rest of you as well. Just to be transparent, I had an email that I had sent to the panelists, and we kind of tried to map out the best that we can, how to best utilize the time we have here. And I think the one thing that I was really interested in getting started is helping to set the context of this, conversation on education, and I guess it's the relationship to language and design. And I believe Dr. Harjo, you were kind of the last one to touch on that email. Would you like to start this conversation?
Yeah, and I know, so transparency too, Leo sent this long list of everything that has to do with education and Indigenous design and typeface design, and it's heavy. There's a long list of things that we can all talk about and that we all have experience in. But I think the message that I'd like to share today is just that design does have a great impact on our Native communities or on our Indigenous communities. Design education definitely goes a long ways. I'll share a little bit more about the impacts of my personal design work in my talk later. But I think it's really important to tell the students here and the people in education and academia that we're all doing great work. You'll learn a lot of what everyone's doing here today. My specific outreach to the community that I worked with, which was the Osage Nation in Oklahoma, was doing observations with the immersion school and designing resources for them, because we didn't have resources in the communities that in our immersion schools. We had a brand new orthography representation of our language, and it's just barely into Unicode, into a usable resource for our teachers in 2014. So that's barely, 8 years ago that it's been trying to function. In comparison to the English language and teaching those, pre-K, kindergarten, immersion school is 6 months and above. Teaching the English language, there's all kinds of resources. There's toys, there's music, there's ABC song, all these things that help these students that aren't, they're oral, but there's a lot of visual resources that help aid in learning. So my research has been focused on how can I help as a graphic designer to create resources for my tribe so that they can use a visual identifier in the classroom, visual resources outside of the oral part. So I just think that there are a lot of great minds out there in education. I learned how to observe people, learn the psychology behind design. I learned, I designed the typeface that was put into the stencils. And I think that there is more to do. Everyone has their own hats and their own tribes. But I think the main point that I want to get across in Indigenous education is that there's not enough of us doing enough work. And you know, I'm only one person. We're only 4 people in our communities. And I think that if you are into like the design education and you are Indigenous, or you are interested in learning about how to work with Indigenous communities, I just want to thank you for being on that avenue.
Yeah, thanks for getting us started, Dr. Harjo. And I just put a couple keywords into the chat if we're interested in, like, you know, better understanding what she's talking about. And Kathleen and Sadie, you know, we can also think about this too, of like, you know, what needs to be like said first, right? Like it was a very heavy document that I sent you guys. And like Dr. Harjo had said, you know, we're all coming from our unique situations, you know, and there's different things that apply to those situations, which are sometimes helpful, right, in the education, and how we can look at those as case studies, right? Kathleen, would you like to go next?
Sure. I mean, I'm not a type designer, but I can definitely echo what Dr. Harjo said about the importance of having tools for teaching language. You know, there's language immersion schools among the Nlaka'pamux that are incredibly important. In one of the last counts, like my community is very small, it's less than 800 people. There were, you know, a handful of people who spoke Nlaka'pamux. And the immersion schools really rely on the tools that have been developed, but they're limited. And I think in thinking about all of the knowledge that can be brought to bear in partnering with Indigenous communities, where, you know, there's 500 Native American tribes, there's over 600 First Nations. There are so many communities with so many different language needs. And it's so important for these communities in terms of cultural revitalization, the work between generations as well, that I think there are real opportunities. And I really expect that Ezhishin, this conference, will be a platform for bridging, I hope, the sort of needs of Native communities with the practitioners, the students who might have an interest in aligning with those efforts. So that's what I'm hoping to see. And I really want to support Dr. Harjo's incredible work with the Osage language.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Kathleen, and good kind of like echoes and keeping this kind of thread of thought. Sadie, would you like to chime in on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime going to a classroom, or anytime like compiling a syllabi, or anytime conducting a workshop, particularly for those demographics that have maybe not be familiar with Indigenous culture to the continent of North America, my main thing is to really nail down that terminology. And I think in this conference being an absolute need when we're talking about words that, you know, like decolonization or decolonialism, or talking about visual sovereignty, or even how to navigate around conversation around cultural appropriation. Like, I feel like there isn't expertise that is non-Indigenous that is sharing how that is demonstrated, how that's performed, and even understanding, and this might be going into when we talk about art versus design, when I'm coming into a design space, kind of really get an understanding of how you design systems, but then also defining design as invention. And as Indigenous people, man, we're inventors, anything, product design, architect, fashion, how visual ways of documenting language, like all of that is invention. So kind of just to credit ourselves and be proud of ourselves as being inventors and boost our confidence, and knowing that there's a lot of invention that's been appropriated. So in thinking about, you know, kind of navigating within this space is really nailing down those terms, because I'm seeing these terms outside the design community where they're talking about decolonization, but they're not, you know, really talking about how a design system can help within, how a designed system can help back in retrieving land, or just even how we were talking about here, revitalizing languages. But the main focus within expertise that we have within experts is that traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, and then even more so how we even make design systems may not be visual. We do it all the time. Like we're experts coming from a tribe. So we should be in positions to be experts. And now it's definitely needed around climate change. And, you know, more tribes are, you know, getting sovereign recognition, more states are turning over land. And those are areas of expertise where we need designers. And even more so, if we want to be sovereign nations, we got to start communicating ourselves visually like countries. So that goes within, you know, one day FIFA World Cup starting. So just even think about like, if a sovereign nation makes it to FIFA World Cup, like we gotta look like a country. So websites, you know, just how we're showing national pride, jerseys, anything that assembles us as nations. So I really try to get students to really think of ourselves as a nation in those aspects. And that's all design.
Thanks, Sadie. Yeah, and I think we can all kind of back that too, right? I think we're all doing great jobs, and definitely a need for more practitioners, you know, both as educators and designers, and then people in the communities, right, doing the work of these programs. And I could also, you know, highlight that we also need this dialogue, you know, and I think that's one thing that this platform is doing is we're creating this platform to define or to push forward these values and concepts, this terminology that we you know, find significant to our practice and our lives currently. And yeah, I think, you know, you could walk into any educational institution, right, and we can hear the word decolonization. And that was one of the terms that we'd kind of like keyed for this, you know, and I'm glad that you brought in, you know, traditional philosophies, right? And like, how does that influence our design process? Also, how does land, like you mentioned, or how does our environments influence that, and then how do we define knowledge in our own traditional community? So I think those are really great things to highlight, you know, and bring into our practice.
Leo,
Dr. Harjo.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add, I think coupling in with decolonization, I love the work that Sadie has done in the design world to sort of platform the issue of decolonization. Like she's, you know, spoken on panels and created resources that other teachers and educators can use. I also really think that into that triad you were outlining, I think introducing the idea of re-indigenization as well as decolonization is really incredibly important as a sort of a making and a reconnection instead of just an unbundling. But I wanted to mention how important the work that Sadie has done in sort of bringing these issues to the fore. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is resource creation for other educators, creating sort of content and building out the canon, which I think is something that Sadie's also going to touch on later. So just to highlight her talk later today.
Yeah, that was also one of the terms that we had touched on, right? Like these ideas of indigenization versus, like you said, decolonization, which is the coming back of the colonial forces, versus like indigenization, which these are forces coming from the communities, which is very important to actually note. And talking about like sovereignty, you know, Sadie's been really good about like her dissemination of visual sovereignty. I kind of want to go into like how does that affect like tribal communities in terms of like language and typography, right? Because that's kind of the platform that we're pushing forward right now. Dr. Harjo, would you like to speak first about this?
Yeah, and I'll touch a little bit on like my viewpoints on the word like decolonization and indigenizing spaces. I like to use indigenizing education because I think it's one of the biggest hurdles that I've come across with working within tribal communities as a graphic designer, as a small business owner, as a professor. And then specifically in my research is there's a mindset that we have to, as a typeface designer, or even as a graphic designer, we have to get over with explaining the need for visual resources, for visual sovereignty, for visual design, because older generations that we work with in Indigenous communities are not afraid of change, but they're a little bit resistant to these new types of technologies being utilized in our, tribal, in our tribes, in our nations, at least in my experience. And so it's been one of the hurdles that I've had to do as educator to really make a base for visual design as being equally as important as oral communication. And I'm using it as an additional resource, not to change to, a visual design, but also use them in tandem. So, using, and we're talking about language, teaching it orally is the best, but when that language becomes extinct, documentation is really, really vital to preserving that language. And that's where, my work kind of comes into, but there's more work. There's always more work to be done with documenting any language. And it kind of stems, that reminds me of like that visual sovereignty and the importance of, and then just explaining that to communities and explaining the need for graphic design to put that in your budget in the language department. Having grants include design work and hiring Indigenous designers, or at least some sort of person that has that expertise to put into the materials and resources that can be designed to represent the work that are going into the communities. And that can be involved with imagery, logos, creation, businesses, all that stuff. I think there needs to be an emphasis in making design more important in our communities.
Yeah, thanks for touching on that, Dr. Harjo. And I liked how you separated, the practice of speaking, right, as a separate thing in design, because we talked about or I mentioned design products, right? When we look at typography, that's a product, right? That doesn't actually encourage, I guess, like the speaking, like it only does to a degree. But I like how you contextualize that too, right? In communities that are experiencing like revitalization efforts, right? Or trying to repair their language. Kathleen, would you like to go next?
Sure. I mean, when you talk about repairing language, I think this, for me, it brings up the sort of damage that was done to the communities that I'm from in British Columbia. My family, my grandmother and my great uncles and aunts and many of my mother's cousins all went to the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And, most Native and First Nations people that you talk to have families that have also attended boarding schools or residential schools. And these schools, many people who are non-Native sometimes are unaware of the history of these schools, but how they really were designed to strip away language, to strip away culture from communities. And the great language loss that occurred there, as well as the sort of physical damage that traumatized students, have really impacted the ability for a lot of smaller communities to preserve their language. So, in thinking about those really important connections and reconnections of language, it's so deeply embedded in sort of repair work. And I love that word that you chose to use, Leo, the reparative work that design can do. And I think, I've had conversations with other Indigenous educators about the importance of art and design as reparative efforts, that they can reconnect sort of the work of the past with the present. And always those moves to create linkages between generations are incredibly important. So those are just some of the things that were sort of coming to mind as I was listening to Jessica and to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. And I think we can all like agree with that, right? Like design and art is reparative. it's a healing, right? As is this language as we, come closer to it, right? Sadie, do you have any thoughts about what we just talked about?
Yeah, so in thinking, and again, I'm kind of echoing Kathleen and saying, like, I don't consider myself necessarily a typographer, but really in wanting to kind of bridge history of semiotics that you read within graphic design textbooks. If you take, just a Eurocentric, just traditional, I guess wherever you might get a degree within graphic design, there's like a canon. And tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about semiotics, but I think just in thinking about when we start to really bring in the conversations, how we communicated with symbols or how we signed, or just even, I think the challenge, particularly within some of my students, or just even in some of the working communities, is people can't envision what the world looks like or how the continent function without English. Like they can't, we're not in a position where we can actually have a visual image in our head of like what the land looks like, what we look like predominantly, 10 million plus, indigenous folks within the continent North America. So when you're trying to communicate a system or a function or a way of signing or communicating, the challenge is really like, how do you get a student to think how to navigate through a daily life without using English? And thinking about when we talk about recording devices or how a symbol allows us to remind us something, or, tomorrow I'll get into like winter counts, but just think about when we're revitalizing, I feel like we're really, how would you say, like, making the way that we communicated as important as English, and not making it seem primitive, and not making it seem like, caveman writing on glyphs on the wall. Like those techniques were invented so that we can record, because we're huge oral, independent, or very strong oral history folks. So I think really trying to just bridge that gap, saying that the way that we invented forms of visual communication, which is now kind of seen as a visual language, was smart, and it is valid, and it is useful, and we need it now. And it's just challenging to be in a place where we just can't envision what it was like before. So my main thing within and thinking about in conversations around type is just, we were so smart inventing a way of recording. And I think just as an educator, sometimes us four within this panel, we got to paint the picture of what it was like before, I guess, contact.
If I could just hop on here, Sadie reminded me of like a project that I've been interested in, which is expanding sort of the history of graphic design to include much of the sort of visual communication of indigenous peoples. And I'm thinking of like the rock writing that is important to Nlaka'pamux, but also there is visual communication in the weaving and the basketry of Silesian peoples, just as many indigenous peoples. And I don't think necessarily, in histories of graphic design, in histories of visual communication, that material culture has often been just completely left out, even though they are communicative methods. There's motifs, there's an understanding that can be read for those materials. So I think that's also an intellectual project to sort of bring the indigenous perspective into the histories that are being taught and disseminated. So I think that's so important. And it is empowering current generations, to see the sort of work that they do in mark making and messaging that isn't necessarily in English, to be sort of inclusive of that design ethos.
Yeah, thanks for adding that and kind of like building off of what Sadie had mentioned. What I really liked about what you're bringing to this conversation is this look at material culture, right? Like, so we're not just looking at the visual culture, but material culture can be looked at as like objects, materiality, right? In our practices in both art and design. And then also what's included in that is locale, right? So like environments and locations and where we find these connections to land. Dr. Harjo, do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I like to always say art is how we communicate as Indigenous communities. It's how we've all communicated throughout history, and art is a broadly designed term. It can be the way that we dress, the way we dance, the way we communicate with each other through body body language, through actual language. You know, art is a communication tool that we use everywhere. So, and to represent who we are as Indigenous people. And so like extending that into typography and graphic design, you know, again, it's a newer way of indigenizing spaces because, you know, we didn't have a computer, you know, 100 years ago. We didn't have digital design as a tool to help us communicate and express art and design. But I think that kind of just reminds me of, like, you know, the importance of visual communication in general as a whole in the nation. You know, it's very imperative that we all include it in the way that we think about. We're talking about, again, about decolonization and indigenizing spaces, and not to overlook that it is a form of communication and how we express ourselves.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. And I really like how, you know, I think what you're trying to kind of say is that we're, you know, the things that are part of our culture, right? They hold a lot of power. One of the things that I had was kind of like wanting to move into next is, like, you know, we have these powerful cultures that we're coming from, and we see them entering these spaces of education and design and typography. How do we see our cultures either influencing or changing these environments?
Yeah, I'll add, because I feel like this is kind of where the quote unquote trend is shifting, is anything around, you know, if you are at an institution, business, you know, designing for a place, a lot of the conversations is like, how are we combating global warming? How, you know, how can we be more eco-friendly? I know with it was the COP conference going on in Egypt right now, like when any time we're talking about how we can design a system that can be combating anything environmental justice related, we have like the design expertise in those spaces. So just in really thinking about, I can really start to see is that if many places are shifting from the diversity, inclusion, equity, and going into how can we be more eco-friendly, or thinking about the initiatives of sustainability, Indigenous designers need to be there, because that's our expertise. Everything, anything land-based or soil-based, or just even inventions-based, or you know, creating a community to function, you know, in a reciprocal framework. That's us. Like, we designed all that. So I can see us being bringing our expertise into this next coming trend as we're combating climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Sadie. And I think what I'm trying to get at too, for students, right, and for Indigenous community members that are coming up right now, right? Like we need those spots like filled. Like I think we touched on that earlier. We need people like in those areas developing them, right, and becoming experts. And that's really necessary right now in the design field, as well as other fields too, right? We touched on art. We can also look at this in changing education too for the better. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on this kind of area that we talked about?
Well, you know, I've been in talks with quite a number of administrators at different institutions who are really interested in recruiting and retaining Native and First Nation students. You know, and often I think what is left out of that conversation, though I hope to always bring a perspective to it, is sort of when you bring Native students, especially away from their communities into higher education in a different location. I think it's really important to build a supportive network. And, you know, just as international students need a huge supportive structure, Native and First Nation students also really benefit when there is a strong cultural support system in place. So two of the schools that I went to had really amazing spaces that brought together students, faculty, staff, community members, and really fostered inclusion and connections. I think it's so important in order to retain and really think about the student as a whole person. So that's just one thing. If you're an educator and an administrator who's here today, I think thinking about what that life will be like for the students that you recruit to campus, that you want to be leaders, that you're hoping to sort of empower, to never let that wholeness like drop by the wayside. I think that is incredibly important. So that's really paying attention sort of to the landscape that your institution resides in, and really building community relations, because those end up being super, super important in order to create a really cohesive environment.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think we can all kind of like back that, right? Like I think these ideas of community and having to go out of our indigenous communities to actually get these I guess educational documents, right? Like to certify us as succeeding in the academic ladder. That's definitely a big thing to focus on. Dr. Harjo, in this kind of like theme of education, do you have any thoughts?
Like just add on for like educators and people at the college level that might be teaching graphic design or history of graphic design. I think it's always helpful to try to include a little bit about indigenous languages and typography efforts. I know it's really broad. There's so many, 500 plus nations in North America. But it's helpful to at least like highlight that there are languages, and there are languages that are documenting and using visual communication, visual design, orthography, syllabaries, and other ways to digital design to help aid in those processes. And because even as a graduate student, when I was in school, going through my master's program and PhD program, a lot of my focus in talking about the research that I wanted to do was explaining the history to people over and over and over. And it took 30 minutes of all my talks, and that's, I feel like that part can be included in these general education classes, so that we're all aware that these things are going on in America, and in Canada and elsewhere. Even going back to my final oral defense, I spent 30 minutes in explaining and answering questions about why is this language extinct, explaining boarding schools and the impact of our Native American communities. And it's hard to go through that history just to get to why my design is important, And so I think that's really a message that I'd like to send out to, even if you're not Native, try to be more inclusive of our communities. And that way we can use your help to expand our reach as Indigenous educators.
Yeah, thanks. Such meaningful words right now, and as we're talking about this, Kathleen and Sadie, I just want to, we're running out of time here soon. I just want to make space for closing remarks for both of you.
Well, one thing I thought of as Dr. Harjo was speaking, and it's a comment that's come up in conversations I've had, is that many people studying in the United States are really familiar with a lot of languages. They hear and recognize Chinese, or they recognize French and Italian. But if they hear indigenous language from the region that they're studying in or that they live in, those languages do not resonate. They're not familiar. So in many ways, I think what we can do as educators from different backgrounds is amplify and expose students to the huge diversity and range of language and typography that is native to this country if you're teaching in the United States. And I would say if you're teaching other places, there are indigenous visual communication tools that can be elevated and amplified in your teaching as well. And I encourage you to do that research.
Yeah, I'll just, I'm so happy, like there's, oh my goodness. As a Indigenous graphic designer and being present in Canada, United States, like just even the conversation we're having now in this conference, like we've been working so hard just to have just like a space like this here. So I'm kind of feeling emotional too, along with all of us here, because man, everybody here who's going to be presenting this conference has done a lot of hard work. And just to even get to this point is such a milestone. So just really, it's I think just telling other non-Indigenous educators, like we've been fighting, like this has been a really tough journey. So just appreciate just having the space to get a chance to just, practice how we communicate this, and again, just a reminder of us all, like we're all still learning. We all still, sometimes get embarrassed sometimes we come in and be mindful that our students are coming in vulnerable, wanting to learn identity, and to get them to kind of be in a position to ask questions too. So I'm happy that this conversation is taking place, and just happy to be in this position. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen and Sadie. I'm very proud of all of you, and it's humbling to be, in the same space with both of you, and to have just this meaningful conversation, as we go into the weekend. I'd invite everyone to, think about the dialogue, like we talked about, the concepts, the terminology, the values that we're putting forward in our work, and I also want to resonate that, like we are educators too, and I think to everyone that's here, like looking at our work and looking at all these other great practitioners, we're the community, right? And we also support you in all of this. So don't feel like you're alone in this fight, which sometimes it's hard to. And like I mentioned earlier, we're all going through our own different situations. So it's best to support ourselves and to remind ourselves that we are a strong community.